Crimea Feodosia. This is what revenge from the armed forces looks like. Military facilities are burning all over the peninsula. Russia's railways are falling apart, trains are derailing. Putin has put on a military uniform and Gerasimov is talking about victories in Kupiansk.
Commanders reported control over Kupiansk, as well as advances in Vovchansk, Konstantinovka and Siversk.
France is preparing for war with Russia. They say it could happen soon.
The defense production will come to the forefront, otherwise we will be under threat.
Britain will send military personnel to Ukraine.
But not to the front lines. Their tasks are logistics, training and security.
A new super drone in Russia.
Russia is in the final stages of creating its most secret stealth drone, the S-70 Okhotnik.
Nuclear weapons near the borders of the Russian Federation. Putin is clearly feeling unwell.
More and more Europeans are losing restraint and thoughtfulness in their approaches. This is quite obvious, really, and some, unfortunately, are allowing themselves such provocative, even questionable behavior.
The YouTube algorithm, which is the system that determines what videos are shown to viewers, generally appreciates and helps to promote content, for example, content that is engaging. The Russian Federation Army has allegedly broken through into Siversk in the Donetsk region, which for some reason is translated into Russian as Severesk, although this city in the Bakhmut district is called Siversk. In particular, the breakthrough is being reported by Bild military observer Julian Röpke. Is this really the case, and what is happening on other sections of the front? We'll cover this and more in our report.
In the night of November 20th, Ukraine attacked one of Russia's largest oil refineries, the Ryazan refinery, for the second time in a week.
Of course, that's good.
In addition, explosions were heard in Novomoskovsk-Tula region. There was also a fire at a substation in the city of Rilsk-Kursk region, which caused power outages.
This refinery primarily supplies the demand for fuels and lubricants in Moscow and the Moscow region, which is a key factor in providing not only gasoline and diesel fuel, but also motor oils. This refinery is affiliated with the Ministry of Defense of the occupying country, specifically for the logistical supply of fuels, lubricants, motor oils, and other components.
The Russians cannot hide or conceal their military objectives, neither on their own territory nor in Ukraine. In this footage, a Ukrainian Air Force F-16 is chasing a Russian Kh-101 missile, which is once again flying to kill someone. Even worse news is reported by Bild's military analyst Julian Röpke. According to his information, the Russian army has broken through from Siversk in the Donetsk region, allegedly capturing 20% of the territory.
In the Kupiansk-Lyman direction, the occupiers have indeed concentrated a strike group numbering about 90,000 personnel. This is considered one of the enemy's strongest strike groups after the Pokrovsk direction. The occupiers' strategic objective is to create conditions for a flanking encirclement of the positions of Ukraine's defense forces. The situation is difficult, but to say that the occupiers have achieved significant tactical successes, or moreover, that they control a substantial part of Siversk, is information that has not been verified at this time.
Only Trump and the United States have the power to finally end the war. Turkey is ready to provide a platform for negotiations. This was stated by the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky.
If Russia does not come to the negotiating table on American terms. Following the delivery of ATACMS, Ukraine may also be supplied with Tomahawk cruise missiles, which have a strike range of up to 1,600 kilometers.
René Obermann, chairman of the board of directors of Airbus at the Berlin Security Conference, suggested that European countries consider deploying tactical nuclear weapons to deter Russia.
This is an element of military political pressure by the United States on the Russian Federation precisely at the moment when a possible agreement might be signed. Peace agreements at the end of the war in Ukraine. In other words, they are making it clear what further scenarios may unfold if the Russian Federation does not come to the negotiating table. That is, the United States, through their European partners, are already making it clear to the Russian Federation that they will continue the policy of increasing their nuclear presence on the European continent.
The possible deployment of tactical nuclear weapons is a response to the threat posed by Russian Iskander missiles, which are stationed in Kaliningrad and Belarus and are capable of carrying tactical nuclear warheads.
Joining our broadcast is the spokesperson for the Ukrainian Volunteer Army, Serhiy Brachuk. Serhiy Borisovich, glad to have you with us.
Glory to Ukraine, glory to the defense forces. Greetings to my colleagues.
Glory to the heroes. Serhiy Borisovich, if you don't mind, let's start with the Pokrovsk direction, specifically Pokrovsk. Just yesterday, footage was released by Ukraine's defense forces. These are shots from FPV drones, so yes, there's terabytes of positive information there. Destruction of enemy forces, destruction of enemy logistics routes in the Pokrovsk direction. But I understand that things aren't entirely rosy. Yes, of course, there are achievements by the Ukrainian army. How are things going?
Well, actually, if we're talking about any major changes on this section of the front, they haven't happened. But today, well, let's put it this way, there remains, let's say, a kind of very conditionally neutral scenario for the development of events, which, let's assume, has been in place. And in principle, we've said that most likely it will continue for several days because the enemy is losing strength. The enemy is losing personnel today. These losses are very significant, so even despite the huge grouping that currently numbers about 150,000 to 160,000 personnel, there has not been any sharp or decisive advance in Pokrovsk. As before, we say that the southern part of the city is under the control of the Russian occupiers, while the northern part is mainly held at certain lines where our troops are positioned. I want to remind you that this is the area of responsibility of the 7th Air Assault Corps of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Honor and praise to our paratroopers. Accordingly, the central part of Pokrovsk is a gray zone where there are firefights, and that's absolutely right. Today, UAV crews are actively working, primarily searching for and destroying enemy personnel, because infiltration tactics continue, as do the logistical routes, which the enemy is trying to use to reinforce and fill their zone of occupation, the southern part of the city, and accordingly to attempt to penetrate into the northern part of Pokrovsk as well. We can see that actual groupings of Russian troops are appearing there, primarily in the form of reconnaissance group battalions. Their task is not so much to engage in combat, but rather to try to preserve themselves and accordingly to accumulate. In other words, once again, it's a tactic of integration. And of course, we're talking about an attempt to put pressure on our logistical capabilities. On the other hand, as is often said, and I can only confirm this point of view, that today the fate of Pokrovsk itself is not being decided in the city itself. Don't be surprised, we can also talk, for example, about a settlement like Rovny, which is to the north of Pokrovsk. Accordingly, this concerns our logistics, our ability to control that logistics, and consequently to destroy those enemy sabotage and reconnaissance groups that are trying to infiltrate and cut off our logistics. But Ukrainian logistics are still functioning. And today the paratroopers are skillfully controlling this area and accordingly are conducting a very active defense. Active defense means taking counter-attacking actions, among other things, which allows us to say that the Russian occupiers are suffering heavy losses. In other words, there are no breakthroughs at the front today, but also notice there are no invitations from any of the bunker Führers for representatives of the so-called media to come to Pokrovsk and see what's really happening there. Of course, the situation can change, and accordingly, it's no secret that the most, let's say, difficult scenarios for how events might unfold, even with a negative outcome, are of course being considered by Ukraine's defense forces. They are being considered because it is necessary to be prepared for any changes that may occur. As of today, this is the current situation. We can probably even say that today the enemy's advance is, let's put it this way, minimal. In other words, there aren't those sharp movements that were happening there before. A few weeks ago, when the enemy entered the southern part of Pokrovsk,
well, it's minimal de facto, but de jure in the reports submitted by the Russian military or Russian military command, they've supposedly already captured almost all Ukrainian territory, or at least, let's say, part of eastern Ukraine. What am I talking about? I'm talking about Gerasimov's report, the chief of the General Staff of the Russian Federation, who reported to Putin about the capture of Kupiansk. Although Ukrainian military officials claim that this is completely untrue, Kupiansk is still partially but under the control of the Ukrainian side. Are there many such examples?
Well, actually, maybe Gerasimov was reporting about some other city because he kept talking about Kupiansk. I don't know, maybe there's something similar somewhere in the Russian Federation, but again, age speaks for itself. We all understand perfectly well that every Gerasimov must have his own mumu. So in his grasp of the genre, this Gerasimov has his own Putin, who wants to hear about victories. Well, even here there are two. Do you know what they call them in the Russian army? Two chief grandfathers. The Russians there are very critical of them, but it's not enough to criticize them. They need to turn their bayonets in that direction. So the two chief grandfathers did not agree on what they would tell each other in the end. One of them talks about 15 Ukrainian battalions. Let's imagine roughly 600 people in each battalion. So say 15 of them. You can easily do the math. And we're talking about Kupiansk railway junction. Look at the map. Look at the area of the Kupiansk railway junction. Where could you possibly fit that many troops unless you line them up shoulder to shoulder? First of all, that's what the main grandpa says, the chief bunker grandpa. Accordingly, Gerasimov reports that it's all set. You can go to Kupiansk because Kupiansk is done for. It's fallen. It's Russian now. For some reason, though, the main grandpa still didn't get ready and didn't go. It's quite likely that once again, another Mosfilm pavilion was hosting the esteemed guest, and this trip to the troop grouping on the Russian-Ukrainian front was being filmed. So the obvious lies in the Russian army. I'm not downplaying, let's say, the combat capability or the overall strength and effectiveness of the Russian army, because today our fighters are facing a truly strong and formidable enemy, well-equipped, highly organized, extremely cynical, with a huge number of personnel, a lot of manpower. Accordingly, we're saying that as of today, it's not that the enemy has no successes here. On the contrary, the enemy does achieve certain results and makes progress in some areas. The operation is proceeding very cautiously. We can say that in the city of Kupiansk, the Ukrainian defense forces have already regained and continue to systematically reclaim the positions that were previously lost during the Russian offensive. Today, the enemy still remains in the city. I probably won't go so far as to say that the liberation of the city of Kupiansk is ongoing. But those positions I mentioned, which were previously lost tactically, are now once again coming under the control of the defense forces. In other words, everything Gerasimov said is exactly the opposite of what's actually happening. This can't really reassure us because the situation on other sections of the front is extremely difficult. And the report also mentioned the city of Siversk. Accordingly, honestly, I wouldn't rely on him, and I recommend the same to everyone. Don't rely at all, to put it bluntly, on this so-called commentator Julian Röpke from Bild, because very often, in most cases, when he takes on such responsibility, he ends up spreading Russian narratives. In Berlin, where he is based, he claimed that 20% of Siversk is supposedly under the control of Russian forces. Honestly, when people say 20 to 30%, I don't understand how you can calculate that in the current conditions of war when there are so many gray zones. There are a lot of kill zones, and accordingly the front line is dynamic. As for Siversk, everything is quite clear. The enemy really is pushing, the enemy really has gathered a large group there. And indeed today, enemy sabotage and reconnaissance groups have already been spotted by our assault troops, our fighters right on the outskirts of Siversk. All of them have been eliminated as of today. However, it's clear that we expect the enemy may use infiltration tactics again in the near future. And that's exactly what we're focusing on.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Well, let's continue the topic of places where the Russian leadership or their doubles definitely won't be going right now. Siversk, Pokrovsk and other directions. There's another one that is definitely not being considered in the Kremlin right now as a destination for a visit. That's the wonderful Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea. Lately, we've been observing a number of strikes by Ukraine's defense forces, which are quite precise and effective. For example, the destruction of radar stations. They hit a helicopter, destroyed it, and so on. In your opinion, is this preparation for something bigger? What am I getting at? When a radar station is destroyed, it's not just to remove the radar station. It's destroyed in order to open access to other, no less important positions of the occupiers. So,
absolutely right. This is depriving them of their eyes, depriving them of their ears, those very same S-300 and S-400 anti-aircraft missile systems that cover the skies over Crimea, which is temporarily occupied. Accordingly, if we're talking about the S-300 and S-400, they also function as instruments of killing, because in this case, they are not just elements of air defense, but systems that strike with surface-to-surface missiles. So, as I have always said and will continue to say, and now I'll take the liberty to announce that in a few days, there will be certain events that will bring us positive emotions from the temporarily occupied Crimean Peninsula. And I'll tell you who this time was responsible for our positive emotions. It's the main intelligence directorate. As usual, it's the group, well, let's say it in Ukrainian, so that the Russians start getting used to it, after all, to the camp-style Ukrainization, pre-Mary. So these primary who are destroying radar stations, in particular, as has become tradition, the Nebo-U, the Nebo-SV, the Terek, these are the radar systems that are the most advanced in the armed forces of the Russian Federation, allowing them to see beyond the horizon. These ones definitely won't be looking beyond the horizon anymore. And here it's absolutely true. We're not just talking about the destruction of air defense systems, although in this way, such tools are paving the way. Yes, perhaps it's not just a road anymore, it's already a highway, some kind of aerial autobahn for our strike assets, including missile-type ones. I'll put it carefully, missile-type assets that are flying, for example, toward the temporarily occupied Ukrainian Kuban. We're talking about oil refineries that are being targeted by these attacks. And of course, the most interesting part, especially in light of recent events, is the port of Tuapse, the port of Novorossiysk. And someone even said, well, the port of Novorossiysk was back in operation the next day because there are two branches at this oil terminal, but now one of them is already a bit crippled and soon the second one will be as well. And there are a lot of other targets there too. For example, the Black Sea Fleet of the Russian Federation. Let's recall the destruction of relevant installations, missile systems, for instance. If we're talking about S-300, S-400 complexes, yes, those kinds of hits have happened. This kind of work will continue, and it's all thanks to the fact that these radar stations are disappearing from the map of temporarily occupied Crimea. In fact, I'm already trying to say that these are not just strikes on temporarily occupied territory of Crimea. Let's call things by their proper names. This is the Crimean Front. A year ago, we probably wouldn't have called it the Crimean Front, but today I think we have every reason to do so.
Yes, it seems so. Once again, the Ukrainian army is striking military and strategic targets of the Russian Federation. The Russian Federation, in turn, is using aerial weapons to kill peaceful Ukrainians. After all, peaceful Ukrainian cities and towns are being targeted. Ternopil is one of the most recent examples, where rescue operations are still ongoing and rescuers are still clearing the rubble, unfortunately, of what is already known. There are 31 confirmed dead, and this number may rise. What am I getting at? Ukraine has various types of air defense systems, including those of its own production. There is an interceptor drone called the P-1 Sun, P-1 Solnce, yes, which it's called the Shahed Killer, the Shahed Interceptor, and so on.
Of course, it's called a bit differently.
It's just that Ukrainian soldiers call it Pisyun.
Well, yes, that's right. Pisyun is its usual nickname. I think the editors won't scold us for this. We can just transcribe it as is.
It is what it is. That's just what they call it, basically. So,
what I was thinking about, well, I was actually thinking about drones. Yeah, those flying machines.
How often is it being used now?
As for drones, I probably wouldn't focus only on this particular drone, even though it has such a catchy and colorful name, because our range of drones today is so extensive that, to be honest, we're also now getting closer to this topic, so to speak, including with our own units. Accordingly, we're working on these issues, and I haven't even had time yet to fully familiarize myself with everything. Today, we're looking at, let's say, those models that have proven themselves obviously primarily on the front lines. And I have to tell you, without naming names for obvious reasons, that, for example, there are drones, let's call them conditional, though they're not conditional, they're real, they do their job well, and they've clearly proven themselves, for instance, on the Kherson front for certain reasons. Again, we're not revealing anything. Accordingly, we worked through these issues, for example, in our other southern regions. In particular, we're talking about Odessa, the Odessa region, where these drones, let's put it mildly, are less effective. There are options, there's another lineup. Please, you can use other drones, and that work has been done. I won't say how many of these drones were received, but I'll put it this way. For example, 3 drones were used in the skies over Odessa, and all 3 hit their targets. In fact, the hits were on a Shahed, a Jiran, and accordingly another Lancet was destroyed as well, also a strike drone. So we see a 100% use rate for the ammunition. That's why today, in this regard, Ukraine has truly moved ahead of the rest of the world, and our engineers continue to work very actively. This is what is really affecting the air situation today and helping to repel enemy attacks. We're talking about Ternopil. There, it's a bit different. It's about missiles. But there, it's also about sanctions, including components. Let's recall, since you brought up the topic of Ternopil and its components, there are so many American parts there, as well as Western European ones. And honestly, at this point, it's almost not even serious to talk about China's involvement there. So when it comes to drones, we really do have the capability today to use drones with the necessary tactical and technical specifications. I don't like this word, but I'm going to use it because it really captures the essence of the process. Scaling up is necessary because weather conditions and everything else affect the operation of our various flying munitions that destroy the enemy. Since we've already touched on the topic of Ternopil, of course, I'll mention our southern borders again. You can see for yourself how Odessa is being terrorized. So for example, over there at that very moment, on that very day when we were with you, we're talking, and I'm almost afraid to say for how many hours in a row the air raid siren has been sounding there non-stop, it seems. And we understand perfectly well that such attacks will potentially continue. So we have to fight back. Yes, we have our own peace plan, or rather a plan for a just peace in the Russian-Ukrainian war. That's what it comes down to, destroying the enemy, destroying their capabilities. In particular, we're talking about the air.
Sergei Borisovich, thank you for your comments and your assessment of the situation. Thank you. Thank you for the information you provided. Until we meet again on air. Thank you. Thank you.